solar flare could trigger blackouts at any time. That's one of the top stories right now on The Wire. Solar flares have been trending, and this is not to be unexpected as our Earth's magnetic field continues to weaken. If you haven't read my 2009 article, it'll be linked down below, the PDF. Solar flares in our Earth's weakening magnetic field, and as it weakens more, and as more holes open and close and then reappear somewhere else, invisible holes that are somewhat difficult for NASA to track, we're going to see and continue to see the solar influence over human affairs. It actually gets very interesting once you realize there's also an influence over human consciousness. But with regards to this particular story, of course, this follows several days of geomagnetic storms. You can learn when there's a geomagnetic storm. You can actually sign up and get an alert from spaceweather.com. There's also spaceweather.gov. When you go to that screen or site, you want to go down to the bottom, look to the right. It has a planetary K index. And so you'll see multiple days, for example, in some cases where it's red. Those are multiple days or chunks of time separated in bars, which indicate on that website 4 hours of time. 4 hours of time. So red, red, red. We have multiple days of geomagnetic storming. Something big is occurring. We are now in solar minimum, but just because we're in a solar minimum doesn't mean that we see a decline in solar activity. There is just less, on average, sunspots. But when it does occur, and when you have multiple solar flares, even M-class solar flares, they can have the powerful effect of an X-class solar flare. When that energy has been built up, or when there's multiple solar flares popping off, they actually get to Earth faster once they're able to create that current, if you will, for lack of a better word. So, of course, we see the northern lights. We are hearing stories about power outages. Welcome to the day and age where people wonder whether it's caused by a solar flare or caused by some sort of clandestine government drill or caused by an EMP from one of our nation's enemies, of course, with technology that the West gave it. The world's become a very complicated place. According to this article, a storm of this magnitude could have an effect on power grids and navigation systems across the Earth's surface. G2 storms, as they're called, that are of this level or intensity, affect plane and military radio systems, spacecraft operations, and could trigger voltage alarms or cause equipment damage in power systems. Scientists are increasingly concerned over the effect of a solar explosion, flare, or storm and the type of effect that it could have on humanity. Our growing dependence on technology puts humans at a greater risk if power grids, planes, and satellites stop working. Obama was forced to issue a chilling warning to the nation in preparation for devastating space weather storms earlier this year. He said, quote, "Extreme space weather events, those that could significantly degrade critical infrastructure, could disable large portions of the electric power grid, resulting in cascading failures that would affect key services such as water supply, healthcare, and transportation. Space weather has the potential to simultaneously affect and disrupt health and safety across entire continents." So there's a couple of points I want to make with regards to all this. The issue of the sun having a dramatic impact on our power grid. It's not new information. It goes back decades. Some people would rather this not be a reality. Some people would rather say, not in my lifetime. And so people get numb to the warnings. They get numb to some of these headlines and they forget the larger picture. And that a lot of this is in conjunction, the increase in solar news that we're seeing from changes in our Earth's magnetic field. Now, what could be really interesting is what we see after the solar minimum, the period in which we're in right now. We're in a solar minimum. At the moment of recording, it is April 25th, 2017. I'd say we've been in solar minimum since the turn of the new year. So this literally is the quiet before the storm. In some of my other videos, I talk about the solar cycles and the war cycles being linked. And I'm going to get into more detail in the future. Talk about Alexander Chavinsky, for those that have never heard of this man that started looking at the battles that he saw, that he experienced, that he witnessed in Russia during the Russian Revolution while he was studying sunspots erupting from the sun. He noticed the correlation. Then he got Chinese sunspot data, because Galileo only goes back to 1600. And then he saw this period of 2,500 years, which in that 2013 presentation I'm showing, okay, here's the period of the Revolutionary War, that particular solar cycle, which is known as sunspot cycle number 1, in and around that period. Fast forward to sunspot cycle 23. And what do we see? We saw the events of September 11th. We saw the protests in and around that period. And then, of course, we saw sunspot cycle 24. We saw the rise of the Occupy movement and other protests in the United States. You can include the Tea Party in that as well. You can include the Arab Spring. See, it doesn't really matter whether those uprisings are organic or controlled. Without a doubt, those in control, they know how the solar flares influence humankind. This is not an area that's studied by anyone. So my plate is full, so to speak, to try to break this down, how I think this works. Now, when we look at the direction of really a new science in understanding certain false flags, certain events are staged or begun during solar flares because of the reaction from the population. How people get all pumped up, people get tense, people get reactive. And if you look closely, you'll also see changes on the earth. Sometimes an increase in earthquakes or tsunamis or other natural disasters, in particular volcanic eruptions in certain areas. It's as if the planet has acupuncture points, just like the human body, and that the planet, parts of it, during certain cycles or solar flares within certain cycles, it's like it's affecting or energetically pressing more on some areas of the planet more than other areas. And perhaps these are also subtle influences that we don't understand as to why some people move from one location to another. So the whole thing is really, really interesting, and it's not disempowering. It's enlightening and empowering when you think outside the box of the grid going down. When we think outside the box of just the way they want us to view the sun. And is there a reason they're chemtrailing? More people are starting to get it. More of you are starting to get it. You're asking yourself, for those of you that are aware of what's going on, gee, it sure seems that they're doing a lot more spraying in recent years. We hear about the sun and human consciousness, the human-sun spiritual connection, and then we see our skies literally sprayed. I don't think that's by accident. I don't think it's by accident at all. And they are actually admitting, they've been admitting for several years, that they're going to use geoengineering to fight what they say is causing climate change. But what's interesting about that is when you do actually try to bring up the sun as an influence with regards to climate change, a lot of people in their control thinking that's been led by the mainstream media and documentaries like Al Gore's Inconvenient Truth that only shows you one particular influence. And I'm concerned about the poisons that we breathe. I understand that the car, the automobile, the combustion engine, it's like some sort of, it's like my soul looks at it as some sort of obsolete technology. Perhaps that's why I haven't maintained my cars enough. It's like there's something about the technology that we're working with that I know on a deep level inside is inferior to what is actually possible. There's a big difference between that and blaming all of the climate change that is occurring on the planet on automobiles. There's something else changing. And it gets really fascinating when you look at the big picture and realize that magnetic fields are changing on other planets. So this is definitely a good time for me to bring back some of that information There is nothing to fear when you're doing the right things in your life, which includes, well, if you're concerned about, things happening in your area, if the lights go out and you're in a dense population center and you have multiple years to prepare, multiple years to do research on off-grid properties, then there's no excuse. Then this can be empowering when you realize we may have a lot of time actually before something is able to take down the current grid as we know it. Instead, I think that we're getting warnings. We're getting warning after warning after warning, and they're also coming through human beings that are providing warnings, and people are concerned about lives, so they want to save lives. That's why Matthew Stein talked with me for 3 hours. You can find that interview on my YouTube channel, where he's talking about preparing for an EMP/solar flare. What people can do, how people can prepare. That's why he wrote a book, When Technology Fails, as well as When Disaster Strikes, to get people thinking proactively. And these books are like 10 years old already, some of them. So consider this to be, some additional information on what's going on, combined with other things for you to think about. Those aren't just periods when we have the solar flares and geomagnetic storms, in which we see protests and civil unrest and war staged. These are periods in which personal goals of our own should be realized, where that energy that's literally in the ether, that we literally almost breathe it in and do something with it. It's like, yesterday, and knowing there's a geomagnetic storm, breathing deeply, engaging in body movements, releasing some of that energy, and being really mindful with it. And a lot of people that are in urban environments, they don't know that they're being affected by these solar flares, and that they're dealing with all this unnatural energies on top of it. Cell phone towers, smart meters, things that affect the frequency of the human magnetic field. So I hope this information is enlightening to people and that it empowers people. And that's one of the reasons why I discuss it, and why I'll be back and discuss this issue in greater detail.